Welcome to the Electronic Armory's second video in the beginner series of developing apps for Android. I'm your Electronic Armorer for Android, and if this is your first time here, I highly suggest you check out our first video in the series. Just follow the on-screen link or find more information in the video description below. In our last video, we showed you how to set up Android Studio, an Android Virtual Device or AVD, set up a new project, add interface elements to our Android app, and finally run our app on our AVD on our computer. Next, we'll show you how to connect those buttons to logic and code and make your application perform some actions based on the inputs. So without further ado, let's get started adding code to your first Android application. In order to make the buttons do something useful, you must follow three basic steps. 1. Get a reference variable to the interface element you're interested in. In our case, these are going to be the buttons that we have for our quiz. 2. Add an instance of an OnClick handler and accompanying OnClick method to perform our logic. In other words, when you click the button, something's going to happen. It's going to call a method to call logic, and so we want to set that up. And then 3, we want to actually create that logic to handle whatever it is we wanted to do. In this case, we want to give the user some kind of feedback whether they were right or wrong. Let's get started. How do we create a reference to one of our buttons? You can add an ID to any user interface element. You can do that via XML or the interface design tool. For most tasks, I prefer the design tool, but when it comes to more complex tasks, I jump straight into the XML and handle things there. To get started, double-click on the UI element you're interested in. You will see a context menu will appear to set an ID. You can also set the text of the button, which we did in the first video. In the last video, we already gave it an ID, but we want to give it a slightly better ID name. Because our ID will be referred to in code, we want to give it something a little bit more descriptive so that we know what kind of button this is. We want to give the ID something a little bit more descriptive because this will be referred to in code, and when we're typing out our code, we want to know what type of user interface element this is. In this case, this is a button, so I'm going to append to the end of this ID button. Do the same thing for the other button. Don't forget, from the first tutorial, we have a hidden text field to display our results. Give it an ID to that as well. This is a text view, so I want to give it a name like Results Text View. Okay, now that we've set up our interface with IDs, let's jump into the code. Our code is located in our Java folder under the package name, in this case, com.electronicarmory.quiz. You find that in the source menu on the left-hand side here. If you don't see the source menu, click Command 1 or Control 1 and click on the file. You'll see some code that Android Studio has already generated for you. What we're interested in is this method here called onCreate. That's the one we're interested in, but you'll see it has a bunch of other code in there as well. Let's ignore this for now and add our logic to the bottom of our code here. So let me put my cursor at the bottom of here and hit enter a few times to give myself some space. Now, if you remember from our steps that we have to take, one was get a reference variable to the interface element we're interested in. The interface element that we're interested in is a button, so I'm going to go ahead and create a button variable. We start that out with the class, button, Android widget, I'm going to hit enter on that, and I'm going to name this button Eclipse button. Again, being descriptive with my variable name so that I can refer to it later and know what I'm talking about. Now I'm going to set this variable equal to the interface element in our XML interface file. How do we do that? Android SDK has a findViewById method where we can pass in the ID and it'll return to us a reference to that element. So let's go ahead and do that. We set this equal to findViewById, and you can see as a parameter that it accepts an int ID. Well, we didn't give it an ID int, we gave it an ID string. Well, that's okay. When you give it an ID, Android SDK converts that into an integer. It's a unique integer, and therefore we can refer to it using the R class, which is an auto-generated class from the Android SDK. We'll talk a little bit more about the R class in future videos, but for now, let's just assume that find by view ID R, the way that we get an ID from our R class, which holds all of the IDs that we have in our application, is we refer to it as r.id dot, and you can see a whole list here of other IDs that exist already in our application that Android Studio and the SDK has already created for us. The one that we're interested in, again, is the Eclipse button. So let me start typing in Eclipse button. Here it is, and you can see that the type of the Eclipse button is actually an integer. And so that's exactly what we want. Let's hit enter on that. And don't forget our semicolon. Once we put in the semicolon, Android Studio underlines the entire line in a red squiggly. That means it has an issue with this line of code, and you can see what the issue is by moving your mouse cursor over the red light bulb and clicking on it. What findViewById passes back is a generic superclass of our button, in this case view. And so what I want to do is I want to cast the return value as a button. I can do this manually, or I can have Android Studio do it for me. I can have Android Studio do that for me simply by clicking on the first item, which is what I want Android Studio to do. Let's choose the first one, and you can see that we now have a typecast of button on the return value of findViewById, and that's going to be stored in our Eclipse button variable. Now our next step is to add an instance of an OnClick handler and an accompanying OnClick method to perform our logic. So how do we do that? After this line here, press enter, type in the beginning of your variable, and setting the OnClickListener is as easy as calling a method called setOnClickListener. And you can choose the first one from this list and hit enter, and it's going to ask for a parameter. The parameter that it's asking for is OnClickListener and then an L. To pass that in here, we're going to create a new instance of the OnClickListener class. So let's start doing that by typing in new space OnClickListener, and Android Studio will kind of figure out what we want to put in there. So the first option is OnClickListener. That's what we want to do, so let's hit enter. Wait a few seconds, and Android Studio will create the boilerplate code for our OnClick method and put our cursor directly in that method so that we can start handling the logic. Okay, this is great, and we want to have it display our results in our results text view. So how do we do that? Pretty much the same as we did with the button. We get a reference to it, and then we set the text by calling a method on that reference. So let's go ahead and do that now. We create an instance of our text view, results text view, and we do the same thing, but I'm going to start out with the cast because I know it's going to ask me for this anyway. So text view and findViewById, and again we have an ID on this called results text view. And so I'm going to call the rClass.id to get that ID reference, and we type in the beginning of our ID, and there it is. Add a semicolon, and now we have a reference to our results text view. We're simply going to set the text on our results, so let's go ahead and do that. We type in results text view dot set text, and we have a bunch of different options here. The first one is the one we're going to use, and we can say Eclipse is no longer supported. We set the text of our results text view to a particular string, but if you remember in the first video, we actually hid that text view, and so what we're going to do now is set the visibility to true. So on our results text view, we set the visibility by calling the method setVisibility, and we pass it a parameter for what kind of visibility we want it to have. It's accepting an int, which is kind of interesting because you'd either think it's true or false, set visibility true being visible or false invisible. What Android Studio is actually looking for is a set of constants that we pass in. So these constants are just simply visible and invisible. So let's type in visible, and you can see all the different ones we have, visible, invisible, they're both ints, so that should work. You can see that Android Studio actually appended the view class referring to this variable. This is a common way of accessing variables globally. Okay, now our text view is set up. We're setting the text for it. We're setting the visibility to visible, and so this should show up on our screen. Let's test it out. I'm going to go up to the menu and hit the play button to run this on our AVD. It's going to ask me a few ones. I already have this emulator Nexus 5 set up, so let's go ahead and hit OK on this one. Give it a few seconds to compile, and it should come up almost right away. Alright, so now if we click on our Android Studio button, you'll see that nothing happens because we haven't set up the logic for that. If we click on our Eclipse button, we should see our text view appear with the text that we typed in our code. And there it is. Eclipse is no longer supported by Google and Android. So let's go ahead and hook up the second button. What you might be tempted to do is get a reference to our Android Studio button and do the same exact thing for our Eclipse button, but what we're going to do is actually reuse our OnClickListener to handle both clicks and test which button was selected and then use that to display the correct results. I'm going to go up here to where we're getting the reference to the Eclipse button, and under this I'm going to add another reference to this button, and we're going to call this Android Studio button, which is the button on our right. It's going to ask us for the ID, so we type in r.id to get all the IDs in our application. Scroll down to Android Studio button, hit enter on that, add our semicolon, give us some space underneath this. Now if you can see from the below code, we're adding a new instance of the OnClickListener and then implementing that, and then implementing the OnClick method in our OnClickListener instance. I'm going to pull this out by highlighting the code in here, cutting this out, and creating a new OnClickListener instance, OnClickListener, and make sure that we're doing the view OnClickListener because we're actually clicking on a view item, which is our button. Now we'll give this a name. I'm simply going to call it Quiz OnClickListener and set this equal to the code that we cut out. Let's not forget our semicolon, and go down and pass that OnClickListener to our Eclipse button. Finally, we'll do the same thing for our Android Studio button, set OnClickListener. Alright, so now when we either click our Eclipse button or our Android Studio button, this OnClickListener above will be called. The way that we have it set up now is very specific to our Eclipse button, and so we want to make sure that we handle the logic for each one. How do we do that? The OnClick method passes in a view variable to tell us which view was actually clicked. So if we do a simple test, if v.getID is equal to r.id.eclipse button, then execute the code that we've written. Otherwise, if v.getID is equal to r.id.Android Studio button, then do something slightly different. I'm going to copy the text from above, paste it in this if method, but I'm going to change the results. So again, I get a reference to our results text view, I set the text, and I set the visibility. Let's change the results here to say, you're correct. Android Studio is the new IDE of choice. You may have noticed that we have two statements that are identical, namely for getting the results text view. What we can do is we can pull that out and put it above so that we only have one line of code. I'm going to cut that out. I'm going to go all the way out of here, and I'm going to set this up here. Since that's already declared up here, we can remove this line as well. Now Android Studio is going to complain that the results text view needs to be declared as final, and you can see that by hovering your mouse over. It's saying variable results text view is accessed from within an inner class and needs to be declared as final. That's easy to do. We just go ahead and add final keyword to the beginning of this line. The reason why we want to set it as final is so that it is a constant and the inner class that we've just declared is not editing this variable. This variable is acting as a global, and it's a very bad idea to edit globals, not only within inner classes, but in general. And so when we set the initial value, we don't want it to change. Alright, now we have our code set up. Let's review this really quickly before launching our application. So in the above three lines, we're getting a reference to our Eclipse button, our Android Studio button, and our results text view, and storing those in three different variables. Next, we're declaring an OnClickListener instance called Quiz OnClickListener, and we're implementing the OnClick method with a little bit of logic to see which button was selected, and based on that choice, what text to set. In both cases, we're also setting the visibility to visible, Anytime that you see duplicate code, it should set off red flags. Let's see if we can pull that out as well. I'm going to copy this out of here and paste it down here. Since we already have it outside of the if-else statement, we can remove it. Alright, so no matter which button we select, we'll always set the results text view to visible. Finally, we're using that instance of quiz OnClickListener and its accompanying OnClick method that we've implemented, and passing that into the Eclipse button and Android Studio button so those buttons know which method to execute when those are clicked. Alright, we're finally ready to go, so let's hit the play button and test our application. Our application is launched, and so if we hit the Eclipse button, we can see Eclipse is no longer supported. If we hit the Android Studio button, you can see our text is different and it says correct. Android Studio is now the new IDE of choice. Alright, in this video we just showed you how to connect our interface elements, namely buttons and text views, to code that we can then execute and show results based on user input. In the next video, we'll show you how to do a basic login screen for your application, accepting user input via the keyboard, hiding text with the password text view, retrieving text from those input text views, and executing logic to see if the login was successful. So join us next time, and if the video was helpful, like it. If you think somebody else could benefit from it, share it. And if you'd like to see more, subscribe.